It was a morning unlike any other in the history of Europe. On January 30, 1649, London awoke beneath a veil of frost, the streets cloaked in silence, as though the city itself understood the weight of what was about to happen. A wooden scaffold, hastily built yet towering with grim authority, stood outside the banqueting house at Whitehall. Upon it, the unthinkable would unfold, a king, not slain in battle, not murdered in the dark by an assassin's blade, but executed by the hands of his own people. Charles I, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, was led from his palace chambers toward the platform. He walked with deliberate composure, but every step echoed like thunder in the hearts of those who watched. For centuries, kings had claimed to rule by divine right, their crown secured not by the will of men but by the decree of God himself. Now that ancient order was about to be shattered beneath the swing of an axe. The crowd pressed forward, shivering in the bitter cold. Soldiers stood rigid, pikes gleaming in the pale winter sun, holding back the restless mass. Mothers clutched their children, old men whispered prayers. No one dared speak above a murmur, for all knew this day would be carved into memory as the moment when England killed her own sovereign. Charles mounted the steps, clad in two plain white shirts so that no one could mistake the tremor of his body for fear. He turned to the small group permitted to hear his final words. Calm, almost defiant, he declared himself innocent of the charges: treason, murder, tyranny. He insisted he had ruled as God's anointed servant, not as a criminal. Yet his protest was meaningless, the decision had already been made. The executioner, face concealed by a mask, stood waiting with his axe sharpened to a cruel edge. The king knelt, resting his neck upon the block. Time seemed to stop. A single breath passed through the crowd, as if all of England held its lungs in suspense. Then came the sound, the thud of the axe cleaving flesh and bone. The head of Charles Stuart was raised high, blood dripping onto the frozen boards. The executioner cried out the ritual words, "Behold, the head of a traitor." But instead of the expected cheers, silence rolled across the square. Groans, weeping, and gasps of horror replaced triumph. For in that instant, every witness knew they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The king was dead. The divine right of monarchy lay severed with him. And the world trembled at the realization that if England could kill her king, no throne in Europe was truly safe. The execution of a king did not end the violence, it unleashed something darker. The English Civil War, once framed as a noble struggle between Parliament and monarchy, now descended into a theatre of cruelty where death itself was staged as performance. This was no longer a war of armies on distant fields. It was a war of messages, a contest of terror, where the bodies of the condemned became props and their agony the script. Enemies were not merely defeated, they were broken. Soldiers dragged prisoners through the streets, bound in chains, paraded before jeering crowds. Some were hanged in marketplaces, their bodies left to rot for weeks, swaying like grim banners above the people. Others suffered the ancient punishments of treason, where the goal was not swift death, but a spectacle of suffering that would brand fear deep into the minds of every witness. In these years, the scaffold became as important as the battlefield. Generals, priests, spies, and even ordinary villagers found themselves facing the executioner's axe or the rope, not for crimes committed in secret, but for the crime of belonging to the wrong side. Public squares became theaters of dread, where justice was no longer blind but blood-stained. A man's loyalty could change his fate overnight, from honored soldier to condemned traitor, depending on who held power that week. The cruelty was deliberate. Executions were carefully staged ceremonies, conducted with precision, designed to send a message. Each axe stroke, each drop of blood, each mutilated body was a performance scripted by those in power to terrify their enemies into silence. Even the church was drawn into this theater of blood. Ministers stood beside gallows, declaring the condemned as enemies of God, assuring the crowd that every scream of pain was divinely sanctioned. And the audience came, by the hundreds, sometimes thousands. Families brought children to watch. Markets closed. Drums rolled. trumpets blared. England turned death into a festival of obedience. The message was clear: resist, and this could be you. But there was a terrible irony. While these spectacles were meant to crush defiance, they also revealed the fragility of power. For if a king could fall, if nobles could be dragged through the mud, then no one was truly safe. The same scaffolds built to destroy enemies might one day be used against the very men who ordered them. The Civil War had begun as a political struggle. Now it was something more grotesque, a blood-soaked drama where fear ruled, where cruelty became law, and where the stage of history was lit not by torches of triumph, but by the flames of vengeance. The trial of King Charles I was never about justice. It was a performance, carefully staged, with the verdict written long before the first words were spoken. The so-called High Court of Justice, created for the sole purpose of condemning him, was filled not with impartial jurors but with men bound to a single outcome: the destruction of their king. From the beginning, Charles refused to recognize its authority. Calm and resolute, he declared that no earthly court could try a monarch appointed by God. To him, this was not merely a legal battle, it was a struggle for the very idea of kingship itself. And yet, his defiance only deepened the determination of his enemies. Many of Parliament's leaders were reluctant, fearful of the precedent they were setting. But the radicals, led by Oliver Cromwell, insisted there could be no peace with a king who refused to be bound by law. The axe, they believed, was the only settlement left. On January 30, 1649, the sentence was carried out. A massive scaffold had been erected outside the banqueting house at Whitehall, the very palace where Charles had once hosted foreign dignitaries in splendid ceremonies. Now, instead of velvet and feasts, there was rough timber and the chilling presence of soldiers with muskets. Special galleries had been built for spectators, but the crowd gathered in hushed fear rather than jubilation. Charles emerged dressed with careful dignity. He wore 2 white shirts, so the cold would not cause him to shiver and be mistaken for fear. Every detail was deliberate. He wished to die as a king, calm, composed, and unbroken. Addressing those close enough to hear, he proclaimed his innocence of treason and reaffirmed his belief in monarchy as a divine institution. His words carried not anger, but sorrow, an appeal to history and to God. Then came the moment. The masked executioner stepped forward. The king knelt at the block. For a long breath, silence hung over London. Then, with a single stroke, the blade fell. The executioner held up the king's head, declaring it the head of a traitor. But the reaction was not what Parliament had expected. There were no cheers of triumph, no cries of victory. Instead, an eerie silence spread across the square, broken only by sobs and gasps. Men and women wept openly, realizing they had witnessed not just the death of a king, but the end of a world they had always known. Charles I, condemned as a tyrant, was transformed in that instant into a martyr. His death did not destroy monarchy, it gave it a ghost, a memory, that would haunt England and the rest of Europe for generations to come. The fall of Charles I did not bring peace. Instead, it opened the door for a new ruler, Oliver Cromwell. Once the commander of Parliament's armies, he now claimed the authority of Lord Protector, transforming England into a republic. But Cromwell's vision of godly rule was forged not in mercy, but in fire and blood. For him, victory was never enough. His enemies had to be punished, crushed so completely that no one would dare rise again. And nowhere was his fury felt more than in Ireland. In the autumn of 1649, Cromwell led his new model army across the Irish Sea, proclaiming that God himself had given them a holy mission. His target was Drogheda, a fortified town defended by both soldiers and civilians. After a brutal siege, Cromwell's men stormed the walls. What followed was not simply battle, it was slaughter. The garrison, numbering thousands, was cut down even after they surrendered. Priests were dragged from their altars and executed. Civilians hiding in houses and churches were butchered without mercy. Cromwell reported proudly that the enemy were put to the sword. Just weeks later, the nightmare repeated itself at Wexford. There, too, surrender brought no safety. Parliamentary troops spilled into the town like a tide of steel and fire. They burned homes, slaughtered defenders, and massacred women and children who had sought refuge in churches. Over 2,000 people were killed in a frenzy of bloodshed so savage that even hardened soldiers wrote of their horror. Cromwell, however, saw divine purpose in the carnage. To him, these massacres were acts of righteous judgment, punishment for the 1641 Irish Rebellion, when Protestant settlers had been slaughtered. He declared that such cruelty would, in fact, save lives in the long run, for the sheer terror of Drogheda and Wexford would deter others from resisting. In his mind, brutality was not a sin but a form of mercy. But to the people of Ireland, it was nothing short of hell on earth. Survivors told of smoke choking the streets, of rivers running red, of mothers clutching lifeless children. Entire communities were wiped out in days, leaving behind smoldering ruins and haunted silence. These massacres burned themselves into memory, scars that would endure for centuries. Cromwell believed he was carrying out God's will, yet to those who suffered beneath his armies, he became a symbol of tyranny and vengeance. The man who had helped destroy a king now revealed himself capable of cruelty just as merciless as any monarch. The Commonwealth had been born in the name of liberty and law. But in Ireland, it was baptized in blood. If Cromwell's campaigns revealed the savagery of war, the punishments that followed revealed something even darker, the deliberate theater of cruelty that became the English Civil War's most enduring legacy. The sentence for treason was no ordinary death. It was designed not simply to end a life, but to carve fear into the soul of every witness. This was the ancient ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering, a punishment so gruesome that even hardened executioners hesitated before carrying it out. The condemned were not led with dignity to the scaffold. Instead, they were dragged through the streets, tied to a rough wooden hurdle. The journey alone was humiliation and torture, their bodies bounced over cobblestones, battered and bloodied, while crowds jeered or whispered in dread. It was a parade of doom, meant to remind the living that mercy had no place here. At the gallows, the rope was tightened around the prisoner's neck. But death was denied. They were hanged only until half-conscious, choking and convulsing, before being cut down to face the next torment. Gasps from the crowd mingled with the condemned man's own broken breath, for everyone knew the ordeal had only begun. What came next was the drawing. Executioners cut open the victim's abdomen and pulled out the entrails while he was still alive. The organs were cast into a fire beside the scaffold, a grotesque offering to authority. Witnesses described the screams, piercing, inhuman, that echoed through marketplaces and squares. Some spectators fainted, others clung to their children. Yet the authorities wanted this suffering seen, remembered, and feared. The final act was quartering. The head was severed. The body was hacked into 4 parts. Each gruesome piece was displayed in a different place, mounted on spikes above city gates, bridges, and towers. These decaying remains became daily reminders that treason would not be forgotten. For weeks, sometimes years, the people of England lived under the shadow of rotting flesh, their every journey haunted by the spectacle of punishment. This was no longer justice. It was a ritual of terror, calculated and rehearsed, where the law itself had become a weapon of vengeance. To be accused of treason meant not just the end of life, but the obliteration of identity. A man's memory was reduced to fragments, his body scattered as a warning across the land. In these executions, England revealed the terrible power of fear. More than swords or muskets, more than armies or battles, it was the sight of the scaffold, the gruesome theater of pain, that truly held a nation in chains. When Charles II returned to England in 1660, the streets of London erupted with cheers. After years of war, dictatorship, and bloodshed, many hoped the monarchy's return would bring stability. But the new king carried with him more than the crown. He carried a hunger for vengeance, a storm that would sweep across the kingdom and beyond. The men who had signed the death warrant of his father, Charles I, were marked for destruction. These regicides, once triumphant revolutionaries, now became fugitives. Some fled across the English Channel, hiding in foreign cities. Others tried to melt back into ordinary life. It did not matter. The king's agents pursued them relentlessly, across borders and oceans. There would be no forgiveness. Those captured were not granted mercy. They faced the same punishment they had once imposed on royalists, the dreaded ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Before roaring crowds, these men, lawyers, generals, ministers, were dragged through the streets like common criminals. They were hanged until nearly dead, cut open, and torn apart. Their remains were displayed as trophies of royal power, mounted high on gates and towers. The people who had condemned a king were now reduced to fragments, their names cursed and their bodies erased. The punishment did not stop with the men themselves. Families of the regicides were stripped of lands and titles. Wives and children were cast into poverty, forced to live in shame. Entire lineages were destroyed, their bloodlines branded as traitorous for generations. The restoration of monarchy was not simply a return to order, it was a campaign of annihilation, designed to erase the very memory of rebellion. And for those who had already died, death offered no sanctuary. Cromwell himself, the great architect of the Commonwealth, was dragged from his tomb. Alongside Henry Ireton and John Bradshaw, his body was dug up, placed on trial, and executed, in grotesque parody. Corpses were hanged at Tyburn, then beheaded and quartered. Cromwell's head was mounted on a spike outside Westminster Hall, where it rotted in the wind and rain for decades, a grim totem of royal wrath. The spectacle was not just revenge, it was theatre. It was a message to England and to Europe: no one who defied the crown would escape, not in life, not in death, not even in memory. The return of Charles II promised peace, but his first gift to the nation was terror reborn. The restoration was not reconciliation. It was retribution, staged with all the cruelty of the scaffold. The fury of the restoration did not stop at the living. It reached into the grave. For Charles II and his loyalists, vengeance would not be satisfied until even the ghosts of the Commonwealth were dragged into the light and destroyed. The most shocking act of this campaign came on January 30, 1661, the 12th anniversary of King Charles I's execution. On that day, soldiers marched to Westminster Abbey, not to honor the dead, but to desecrate them. With iron tools, they tore open the tombs of Oliver Cromwell, Henry Ireton, and John Bradshaw, the men who had helped to condemn and kill a king. Cromwell's body, embalmed and sealed in lead, was astonishingly well preserved. Recognizable even after years in the grave, it was paraded through the streets like a criminal still awaiting trial. The symbolism was clear: death was no refuge, no shield against the wrath of the monarchy. The people who had ruled England as a republic would be humiliated, condemned, and executed all over again. The corpses were dragged to Tyburn, London's infamous place of execution. Crowds gathered in eerie fascination. There, under a bleak winter sky, the bodies were strung up on the gallows as if they still breathed, as if they still had hearts to stop. For hours they swayed in the wind, grotesque puppets of vengeance. Spectators laughed, jeered, and hurled insults at the lifeless remains, taking part in a macabre carnival of justice. But the punishment did not end with hanging. The corpses were cut down, and the executioner set to work as if the men were still alive. Cromwell's head was severed, lifted high, and displayed as a traitor's trophy. Alongside it, the heads of Ireton and Bradshaw were mounted on long spikes. The grisly relics were carried to Westminster Hall, the very place where Charles I had been tried, and there they were fixed above the building, staring down at London for decades. Rain, snow, and the passing of years did not erase them. The head of Oliver Cromwell, once the most powerful man in England, rotted slowly in the open air, a ghastly monument to royal revenge. Travelers who entered the city could not avoid the sight. For generations, Londoners lived under its shadow, a daily reminder that rebellion against the crown would be punished even beyond death itself. It was more than execution, it was erasure. The Restoration sought to destroy not only the lives of its enemies but their very memory. And in the grotesque spectacle of mutilated corpses, England learned a lesson etched in blood and bone: the wrath of kings could follow you into eternity. If the scaffold was the stage of vengeance, the courtroom became its script. In the years following the Civil War and the Restoration, justice itself was twisted into a weapon. The ancient protections of English common law, jury trials, presumption of innocence, the right to counsel, crumbled under the weight of political necessity. What remained was not law, but terror cloaked in legal robes. Special tribunals were created, not to deliver justice, but to deliver verdicts already decided. These courts were swift and ruthless. Trials that once stretched for days or weeks were compressed into hours. The accused barely had time to speak before the sentence of death was passed. And the evidence? Often nothing more than suspicion, rumor, or a confession ripped from the prisoner's lips under torture. No one was safe. Generals who had once commanded armies found themselves dragged before judges who had already condemned them. Merchants who had sold grain to the wrong side were branded as traitors. Priests who had preached the wrong sermon, or simply remained silent at the wrong time, were accused of harboring loyalty to the enemy. Treason, once narrowly defined, expanded like a shadow until it covered nearly every act, word, and gesture. Torture, long forbidden by English tradition, returned under the excuse of emergency. Prisoners were racked, beaten, and starved until they confessed to crimes they had never committed. Their broken words, scribbled down by scribes, became evidence in trials that were nothing more than theater. Even silence could be twisted into guilt. To remain quiet was to deny the authority of the court, to speak was to condemn yourself. The atmosphere across England grew suffocating. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, fearing that a careless word could reach the wrong ears. Informers thrived, pointing fingers for reward or revenge. Soldiers stormed homes in the dead of night, seizing men and women whose only crime was a forgotten association, a chance meeting, or a word spoken months before. The terror spread beyond those executed. Families of the condemned were left ruined, lands confiscated, homes seized, children branded with shame. Communities lived in constant dread, never knowing who would vanish next. The law, once a shield, had become the very blade pressed against their throats. This was not justice. It was judicial murder, carefully staged to appear legitimate, but in truth a performance of power. It taught a grim lesson: when political survival demanded blood, the courts would provide it. The scaffold might end lives, but it was the courtroom that ensured the supply of victims. And so England learned that even the law itself could be corrupted into an instrument of terror. The executions of the Civil War and the Restoration did more than extinguish lives. They reshaped the soul of a nation. Each scaffold, each public ritual of death, became a performance staged not only for punishment, but for indoctrination. Justice was no longer about law, it was about fear. Citizens were herded into squares and marketplaces, compelled to watch the condemned take their final steps. Drums rolled, trumpets blared, and the crowd was forced to bear witness as bodies were broken. Children clung to their mothers, trembling at sights they could not forget. The message was clear: resistance was futile, defiance suicidal. In England of the 17th century, terror itself had become the crown's most reliable weapon. The authorities understood the psychology of fear. To kill quietly in a prison cell was meaningless. To kill in the open air, before thousands of eyes, was unforgettable. The executions became a kind of civic theater, a gruesome lesson repeated again and again. The sight of neighbors dragged to the scaffold, the sound of their last words, the smell of burning flesh, all of it lingered long after the bodies were gone. These memories clung to families, passed down like curses from one generation to the next. But fear has strange effects. While it silences in the moment, it breeds resentment in the long run. Many who wept in silence at the scaffold began to dream of something different, a a society where power could not wield terror so freely. The horror of public executions planted the seeds of change, demands for constitutional government, protections of law, and the idea that even kings must be bound by justice. Still, the scars remained. For decades, English towns lived under the shadow of decaying heads displayed on spikes, reminders that law had been replaced by vengeance. Families of the executed lived in disgrace, children marked by their fathers' deaths. Communities whispered in fear, never sure when the knock at the door might come. A culture of suspicion took root, one in which trust eroded and survival meant silence. Yet in time, the blood and brutality also served as warning. Future generations looked back on this era not with pride, but with dread. The lesson was carved into memory, that terror may rule for a season, but it cannot rule forever. From the gallows and the scaffold, from the shrieks and the silence, emerged a new conviction, that liberty and law must be stronger than fear. It was a legacy written in blood, but it pointed, at last, toward a different future. The English Civil War did not end on the scaffold, nor with the return of a king. Its true legacy was carved into the flesh and memory of a nation. England had torn down its own monarch, shattered the illusion of divine right, and revealed to all of Europe that even a king could bleed, even a throne could fall. On January 30, 1649, when the axe struck Charles I, the sound echoed far beyond Whitehall. Across the continent, royal courts trembled. Monarchs looked at their crowns with new unease, sensing that their power was no longer eternal, that their subjects might one day rise against them. It was a revelation that changed Europe forever. The English had shown that revolution was not a dream but a possibility. But this lesson came at a dreadful price. For decades, England lived beneath the shadow of the gallows. Men and women were dragged to their deaths in squares and marketplaces. Priests, merchants, soldiers, and even nobles felt the sting of justice twisted into vengeance. Children grew up beneath the sight of severed heads rotting on spikes, a grotesque warning that haunted them for years to come. The Civil War left not only broken bodies, but broken trust. Neighbors turned against one another, whispering suspicions into the ears of soldiers. Families lived in disgrace, punished for the sins of fathers long dead. The law, once a shield, had been sharpened into a blade. And though regimes rose and fell, Parliament, Commonwealth, Restoration, the cruelty of executions bound them all together. Terror had become a language every ruler understood. And yet, beneath the fear, new ideas began to stir. Ordinary people, forced to watch the horrors of scaffold and spike, began to imagine another way. They dreamed of limits to power, of rulers bound by law, of rights that could not be stripped away by decree. The horror of the English Civil War planted the seeds of constitutional government and the rule of law. From blood and bone, from screams and silence, the vision of a different world began to grow. Still, the scars remained. For centuries, the English would remember the blood-soaked stage of their own history, the fall of a king, the tyranny of vengeance, the corruption of law into terror. It was a warning to the future, that once fear becomes a government's tool, humanity itself is at risk. The legacy of England's Civil War was more than politics. It was a lesson carved into the conscience of the world: no power is absolute, no throne unshakable, and the price of tyranny will always be paid, in blood.